Alright guys, we are back. We got another tier list here for Fire Emblem Heroes. So the other day we did a tier list looking at support units and what I considered to be the best support units in the game. Today we're going to be doing a debuff unit tier list. So we're looking at units that have various effects that may hinder the opponent or try to make their units end up being worse in combat, whereas the support units have effects that make your own units look better in combat and make them stronger. So I'm not too sure if I made that clear enough yesterday. I probably went over a couple of people's heads there, because some people were kind of confused at placements. Like, we had Duo Thor all the way at the bottom yesterday, and that's because World Breaker is really the only support effect that she has that makes your units look better. Whereas when it comes to debuffs, she's the queen. There's nothing else better than her when it comes to debuffing enemies and taking away their bonuses and etc. So that's what we're looking at today here. So I just want to make that clear. Also, the ordering in these tier lists don't really matter. I'm not trying to say, like, Thor is probably the best debuffer, but I'm not trying to say she's like a million times better than Mark, who's in the same tier, or anything like that. They're all like relative. So I tried to get these tiers grouping, like, I tried to group together units that are relatively the same in terms of power of their debuff effects. So that there's no real reason to pay too much mind to the placements here. I just placed them however I felt. So let's get started. We're going to start with S+ tier. We have Duo Thor, probably the best debuffer in the game. She's really effective in summoner duels in particular, where she can stall enemies like Brave Seliph and also Summer Ephraim, cut them down from being able to move 4 spaces into being able to move 1 space. And then she also inflicts exposure as well. So she's just insane when it comes to utility for that. Then there's her duo skill to take in mind, which turns off all of the bullshit. Like, if the enemies are trying to run at you with a bunch of grand strategy units or a bunch of bonus doubler units or like yada yada yada, they got a ton of bonuses active. They've got duo Hinoka or legendary Hinoka giving everyone charge. You just pop this duo skill and turn all of that off. Yeah, so this is like the get out of jail free card pretty much for summoner duels, so that's why she's here. She's also effective in AR as well if you want to run her on offense or defense teams. Exposure, just adding damage, is really helpful everywhere. Next up, we've got Emblem, who was like basically there was nothing you could do about her. She was uncounterable in Chaos Season in particular, where you could just run her on offense and then turn off enemy save skills. So she was really tough to make a solid defense to beat, but now that we have King Freyr, there is at least one answer that we have in the pocket for her. So that at least helped us for Chaos Season. But in Summoner Duels, she's really effective still. A lot of the maps are very biased towards flyers. You can put her on a very easy tile that she'll be able to target all the foes at the top. And then with her ability to fly, it's easy to move her around and just inflict undefended and feud on enemies. So units like Fallen Maria and also Ymir, who have miracle effects to protect their allies, not going to be able to after you get feud off. And then also the Undefended. What do I have to say about that? One of the best effects that we can do. Next up is Duo Shamir. Now, this is a nasty debuff unit. Actually, I'm going to pull her up. I don't actually have this Shamir. I had her for like all of 5 seconds, and then I foddered her off for Brash Assault and Remote Sparrow. So let's just quickly take a look, and then we'll take a look at her duo skill also, which is a very strong debuff as well. So what she does here is she inflicts Discord and Panic on the nearest foes within 5 spaces of her. And then it's a chain effect where that targeted foe will also spread it like a disease to targets within 2 spaces of them. So it's easy to get Discord and Panic on basically the entire enemy team. And what Discord does is it's basically like a reverse of the Owl Tome effect, where you're doing a bunch of debuffs to the enemy based on how many allies they have within 2 spaces, with a max of 5, but still that's really strong. And it's not a red debuff, it's an in-combat debuff, so it's not like it's helping Legendary Robin in particular, where he wants all of his guys to be getting red debuffs so that it powers up Grand Strategy. And then Panic, of course, very nice, and then we come up to the Duo skill, which it just puts the amount of debuffing over the top. Inflicts Gravity on foes in cardinal directions, and then Feud on foes in 5 rows and 5 columns. Feud, as we mentioned already with Emblem, can really hurt a lot of support units. And then, of course, Gravity is like one of the sickest effects. So she's got to be an S+. And then finally, we have Young Mark to finish up S+. His duo skill is also really good, but then not only does he have access to that duo skill, he's also able to use some debuffs in his base kit as well. So we take a look at his weapon first before coming to the duo skill. At the start of the turn, he does all stats -5, sabotage, and stall on the closest foes in 5 spaces, and then foes in 2 spaces of those foes. So another chain effect debuff, similar to Duo Shamir that we saw over there. Any chain debuff effect where you hit a target on the enemy team and then foes within 2 spaces of that target are really strong. Because, for example, like when we start talking about these units like Aversa and Cornelia, where they need the enemies to be adjacent, there is counterplay to that. You just stand 2 spaces apart. But that doesn't really work with the chain effects, where you still need to be within 2 spaces and then you're chaining the effect to those enemies as well. Like, this is just a way better way to do it, and it's very consistent and strong. So again, stall, very strong. Sabotage, really good. He's got good res, so he's free to run like sabotage, attack, res, and get a lot of debuffs there. He can also have Kanto control, and then he also has pretty much one of the best duo skills for summoner duels, where he inflicts isolation, guard, and then special cooldown count +2 to foes in 3 rows and 3 columns centered on him. So if they've got pre-charged specials, you just turn all of that off. If they've got Hardy Fighter, you just remove their pre-charged Pavis or Aegis, and your units can have a much easier time getting through those save enemies. So just a really strong duo skill. I was very, very ready to put Duo Ike in S+ as well. I was on the cusp of doing it, but Mark just offers a little bit extra in that support, being able to have sabotage, attack, res. I feel like his duo skill is slightly better with the isolation effect that he also does. Ike's duo skill is really the only support effect that he has. You're free to give him Kanto control, but at this point, I feel like you need to give him a speed boosting C skill at this point, because what was his base speed, like 42? And he does have a super boon on speed, but if you get him plus speed, he's only at 46. Comparatively, Duo Shamir, without even having a super boon on speed, just like base speed Ymir, or base speed Shamir out of the box, is just faster than Ike with his super boon on speed. So you need to give this guy as much speed as you possibly can. So Kanto control, not quite as efficient on him as it used to be. And his duo skill, it's actually, maybe in some ways you could say it's better than Mark's, because it targets in 5 rows and 5 columns centered on him, whereas Mark is only 3 rows and 3 columns. So the effect radius is bigger. You're still doing the special cooldown count +2, and then you also inflict guard, and then you also do attack and speed -7 on the enemies. So could be really good and really efficient, but I just wish it was a reusable duo skill. Like if he could do it at the start of every odd number turn, that would be so much better. Because really, the only thing you're getting out of him is his duo skill. And then he himself as a unit, I feel like, not quite the best anymore. He's gotten a little better with like Gambit 4 and some of the new skills that we have, the new passives. But I can't really recommend him for anything outside of his duo skill. Then we've got Gatekeeper, who is literally about to refine in like 3 or 4 days from now. So no telling how much better he ends up getting, but already what he offers is the best in the business. There's only 2 Warp Bubble units that we have, and he's the better of the 2 in my opinion. He has Warp Bubble, he's got also Bulwark built in, and then he's a very good unit to give Kanto control to. You can't give that to Mur, so just even more hindrance of what the enemies are able to do. So I feel like he is definitely worthwhile to be running if you've got the space for him on the team. We got Satyr as well. Satyr's a really interesting unit because she can just end the enemy's turn if she lines up with them in cardinal directions, and she wins a res check, which it gets a little bit steep the further away you are from the enemies, but the closer you are, the res check gets more lenient. So you can easily shut down like 3 enemies at a time if you put her in the right spot. And there's not really anyone else that does anything like that. So she's got a lot of utility to her, a lot of play styles you can do with her that really accentuate how good that effect is. So she's definitely S tier. Reeve is up here pretty much just for stall, but also he does all stats -5 on the target on the enemy team with the lowest speed, and then it spreads like a virus to all the enemies that are within 2 spaces of that target. So stall, like we mentioned before, with all these other stall units is very good. Yune is a really nice debuffer, but it's only for stats. She does essentially all stats -7 to the entire enemy team. It's not really the entire enemy team. It's like a better version of a chill effect where it targets the enemy on the enemy team with the highest stat for each stat, and then it spreads to enemies in 2 spaces of that target. So you could basically just say it's like all stats -7 for the entire enemy team. And then she also does panic as well, so quite a lot of debuffing stat-wise from her, but not so much in terms of like extra effects like these other guys are doing. We got Geralt as well. He targets the enemy on the team with the lowest defense, I think it is. Let's just double check. Let's make sure we're getting our facts right here. And then it's the target with the lowest attack and defense combo, maybe. Let's see. Yeah, the highest attack and defense combo, highest, not lowest. He does attack and defense -6 and then panic to that target and targets in 2 spaces of those foes. So, again, these like spread debuff effects are very strong. Gunthra and Harid do the same thing. They target one enemy on the enemy team with the lowest speed and then foes in 2 spaces of that foe. And they're doing some stat debuffs there. So these two are pretty solid debuffers for stats. We've got Gregor as well, who does in 3 rows and 3 columns at the start of both turns, your turn and the enemy turn. So that gives him a little bit of playability in ARD, I guess, if you want to run him there. So 3 rows and 3 columns, they're taking, what is it, attack, speed, and defense -6, I think. Let's see here. I don't have these like debuff units on the memory like I do with the bonus units, because I use the bonus units a lot more. Yeah, it is -6 attack, speed, and defense to foes in 3 columns and 3 rows. So a very nice radius of effect there. Pretty easy to debuff multiple enemies, and it works at the start of your turn and the enemy turn. Zephyia does panic, and then I think it's speed and res -6. I can't believe I have to check Zephyia, right? She recently came out, but she does panic, and then she does, what is it? Speed and res -6 to the nearest foe in 5 spaces, and then chains to foes in 2 spaces of those foes. So very easy to activate condition there. Very easy to beat within 5 spaces. S does a similar thing, except instead of doing stall, she does exposure. So you can spread exposure and some stat debuffs with S, which is really nice. S is a pretty solid debuffer after the refine. We've got this Valentine Leo up next. Now, this guy is pretty interesting, too. I just wish his effect radius was a little better than just the same column as him. So, enemies that are in the same column as him, column or row, I think it's just cardinal directions, right? So, the same column or row as him, they're going to take some stat drops. They're also going to get hit by gravity, which is very nice. Gravity is one of the best start-of-turn effects you can do. It also activates at the start of the enemy turn also. So similar to what we saw with Gregor, you can easily just get a ton of debuffs on the enemies like this. And it's effective on ARD as well if you want to try to gravity foes there. So defense and res -7, and then gravity, which is pretty good. He just has to have higher res than the foe, which he's probably going to with 45 base res that he's got. So not bad. All right, Veld is an interesting one. Veld is on here. He's got gravity as well, but he does it in a different way than Leo. So at the start of turns 1 through 5, he's going to inflict attack and speed -7 and gravity on the foe on the enemy team with the highest HP on the first turn, attack on the second turn, speed on the third turn, defense on the 4th turn, and then res on the 5th turn. So you never really know who you're going to target with Veld. It's like throwing darts at a board, but it's still a very nice start-of-turn effect with no range condition at all. So just existing, he's going to inflict gravity and attack and speed -7. So that is very good. He's also going to get a refine eventually, so he's probably going to get a lot better too. All right, next up we got a bunch of dancers here. I threw Satyr in there as well. We'll talk about Satyr a little more in a sec, because I know people are very upset about yesterday, but I'll explain myself, or at least try to. Okay, so we have the 2 Mirabilises. This one's, the Mythic one is about to get her remix in a couple of days, so she's probably going to end up being way better than the Christmas one. But for the time being, they both do pretty much the same thing. They dance on a target, and then they inflict attack -5 on the foe that is closest within, I think it's 5 spaces of the target you danced on. They're going to do attack -5. And then any foe with a penalty that is in 3 columns or 3 rows centered on them, they're going to take all stats -3. So these two are pretty solid debuffers just for that. They also dance with the support. Triandras, these two are inflicting a ruse effect whenever they dance. So they target an ally to dance. They're inflicting guard and all stats -3 on the foes in cardinal directions. And then also, if a foe is in a cardinal direction of either Triandra, they're taking defense and res -4. So can be a nice little way if you line them up with the enemies. You can get some more damage out of your other units that are attacking. So pretty solid. Then we've got Ninian, who also has a ruse effect. She dances an ally, and then she does attack and res -7. And also inflicts guard on foes in cardinal directions. So she's in here. And then Hater. All right, so yesterday I had Hater in B tier for the support unit tier list. And honestly, like looking back, that was probably a little too low. I was being way too harsh on her. She at least should have been in A tier at the very least. But I feel like S tier and S plus was definitely pushing it for her because she's definitely got her flaws. You got to wait a lot of turns before you get to the real juice of her support. So like Treachery and Dual Strike are on turn 3 and 4, which is way too long in my opinion. If it was Dual Strike on turn 3, maybe I would have gave her a little bit more favor because that times up nicely with the Bolt Trap. But I don't know. I'm not like the biggest fan of her in terms of just like as a support type of unit. I feel like there's better options that do the same thing with like more utility involved. For example, Cordelia can give pretty much the same effects at the start of the first turn, and then she gives a massive amount of warping. So Cordelia, we had an S plus, and then we had Hater in B tier. But looking back, I probably should have had her higher, like at least A tier. So forgive me for that, y'all. That was my bad on that one. But today we have her in S tier for debuffing. She has a ruse effect with Gold Serpent. So she inflicts all stats -4, and then she also inflicts guard on foes in cardinal directions after using her assist. And then she can still move again. So similar to all these dancers, they're just like able to debuff the enemies for free, essentially. And then you're not wasting any actions because the dancers can refresh, and then Hater can just move again herself. So it's like a free debuff pretty much. So that's why I like them. And it's very controlled too. You can pretty much choose who you're debuffing with these guys. All right, and then finally we got these two duo heroes. I was debating whether I should even put them in here. Because, like, really the only debuffs that Nina has on her base kit are Dagger 7 and then Chill Defense Res, which can be inherited by anyone. And you probably don't even want to run it on her anymore either. I feel like there's better B skills you can give Nina. But she still has that duo skill, which is crazy, right? So if any foes are in cardinal directions of her, I think, what does she do? Does she inflict gravity or something? Hold on. Let's see. I was about to write Booba there. It's a good thing I didn't write Booba. I don't even know how I did that. Okay, so, all right, Thief Nina, she does, let's see here. Foes are in cardinal directions, or if a penalty is active, she does all stats -7 and panic. So I don't know where I was thinking of gravity there, but this is a very strong debuff. Just doing all stats -7 and panic if the enemies have a debuff on them somewhere. And what makes the icing on the cake here is that this is a reusable duo skill. You can pop it at the start of every third turn, I believe. Yeah, at the start of every third turn, you can use this duo skill. So that's 2 actions you'd be able to get out of that in Summoner Duels. So I had to have her in here. And then Duo Elise pops Dominance way better than Duo Micaiah does. Micaiah should have probably been on this list too, but I mean, there's like so many units, and this unit just does it way better, and she does way more things than Micaiah. She's a staff unit, so she can have Holy Pressure, Holy Panic, or Light's Restraint, which is easy debuffs on the enemies. Then she also has built-in Flash on her weapon, and then you're free to give her like odd and even recovery for support, and then also the duo skill, which does dominance in 3 rows and 3 columns, and also defense and res -7 on the target enemies in that space. So had to have her on here as well. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the A tier up next. There's a lot of things in A tier. All of these units are viable debuffers, I would say. They've got like menace effects or like chain effects where they can hit a target and then targets and 2 foes of that target. So we're starting with Myrrh, the other of the 2 Warp Bubble units. That's really the only debuff or disruption type of effect you would get out of Myrrh is Warp Bubble, whereas Gatekeeper is getting a lot more. But then Myrrh is just way better in combat than him, so I mean, pick whichever one you like best, I guess. I prefer the utility of Gatekeeper, plus he's a blessable unit, unlike Myrrh, so it's easier to run him on defense teams in AR to shut down like Wings of Mercy, Jump, Gale Forcing, and etc. Whereas Myrrh is only runnable in one season, so that is another hindrance for her. All right, we got Legendary Robin, who he's more so of a like godly support, but then he still has a debuff effect, which is nice. He does all stats -3 on the closest foe on the enemy team, and then it chains to foes in 2 spaces of that target. So very easy for him to just do -3 to the entire enemy team. We've got the Fallen Crom here, who he's one of the better users, actually, of Sabotage, or not Sabotage, Snag, Speed, and Defense 4. So that could be a pretty solid debuff effect. It does Speed and Defense -7, and then inflicts the Sabotage penalty on that target. And then he also does Exposure as well when he uses his Reposition with a second action. So similar to these dancers we had over here, it's just a free debuff. He repos, he gets the debuffs off, and then you don't really waste any actions for the turn. So nice little... We maybe could have bumped him up, but I don't like the way that his chaining works. So Snag 4 and also his Exposure only chain to enemies in 2 spaces of the target if they have a save skill equipped. So it's not like he can debuff the entire enemy team at will, which is the one downside there. Dressir is able to inflict Exposure on the nearest foe in 5 spaces, and then it chains to enemies in 2 spaces of that target. But it's only Exposure, which is still good, but some of these other units are doing like multiple other effects, like stat drops and a debuff, so I had her in A tier. We have the Harmonic Dorothea, who has basically Omni Chill built into her weapon. It's pretty solid. Even in Summoner Duels, I've found this to be pretty effective. Because, like, as the fight goes on and you're KOing more units, the debuffs start to pile on even harder. So, if they have less units left, they're taking more debuffs from the chills. So, I do like this unit. We got Walmart up next. This dude, he should be at Walmart, because this dude is like a budget right now. He's a budget option, if ever there was one. I don't think he's too effective in combat anymore, but his support effect is still as good as ever. All enemies that are within 4 spaces of him are going to get flashed, and then they take some stat drops as well. So, can make your other units fight a lot better. It's nice for, like, PvE content more so than PvP, I would say. So, he does have his uses. Then we got the Baby Larichel, another staff unit that can run all of the debuff staff skills. Like, I was going to say Exposure, but I meant to say Light's Restraints and Holy Panic and Holy Pressure and stuff. And then at the start of turn, she has a Menace effect for 5 spaces where the nearest enemies in that space are going to get flashed and also take res -7, I believe it is. So she's got some utility there as well. We got the Adrift Camilla, who does not all stats. I think it's attack, speed, and res -5 to the nearest foe in 5 spaces, and then it chains to enemies in 2 spaces. So pretty good. You can get a lot of stat drops with her. Arvel only does guard. He inflicts guard on the enemies in 3 columns centered on him, 3 columns in 3 rows that have less res, and his A skill does give him visible res, so it's very easy for him to meet that check. You're free to give him like Sabotage, Attack Res in the B skill. You're free to give him Canto Control, so he's a very nice option for defense teams that can do a lot of stuff. The guard is nice to help mess with enemy Gale Force setups, and his only competition for that infantry Canto Control slot is Seiros, which I would say this guy is just way more effective than her, so he definitely deserves to be here. We got the Brave Camilla, who can debuff enemies in 3 columns and 3 rows centered on her by defense and res -7. That's all she really does with that, but then you're free to give her all of the new staff specials that also have built-in debuffs, so that would be an option. Legendary Hinoka. I can't believe she's this high up on the debuff tier list, and she was all the way in S+ for the like support unit tier list. This is truly a unit that they really gave way too much to. So this is part of her C skill. She does a rain effect where enemies in 3 columns and 3 rows centered on her take attack, speed, and defense -5. Like, what the hell, dude? Why? Like, why give that to her when she's already giving charge? She's already giving the special acceleration. This unit, they went way too hard on her. They gave her way too much. All right, then we got the 2 Plumeria units over here. I feel like the other ones are a little better. What Plumeria does is she debuffs after dancing the nearest enemy within 4 spaces by all stats -4, and that's it. Unlike some of these, it doesn't chain to targets in 2 spaces, and it doesn't add any additional effects like guard for her. So I had her down here. Okay, we got Milla up next for the isolation. That's pretty much all she does as far as debuffing is concerned, but it's like, there's not really too many other light mythics you'd rather run outside of Milla for just like debuffing enemies. So that's nice, and then she can still help the team with her massive amount of support. So I think A is fair for her. Then we got a bunch of menace effects here. Like this New Year Goonthra has a menace effect where the enemies within 4 spaces are all taking all stats -6. Morim is similar. He does all stats -6 to enemies that are within 4 spaces. It's not the nearest one either. It's just all enemies. And this Morim got a lot better. You can give him like Beast Sense 4 now. So he's always transformed to get the tempo, and then he gets speed-based DR now, which is nice because his speed was pretty solid. This Male Morgan right here, he does a menace to attack, speed, and res, -5 to the nearest foe in 4 spaces. And then he buffs himself based on if he's able to debuff. So it's literally just a menace with him. Hilda also has a menace. This is Hilda from FE4, not Hilda, the pink hair Hilda. So this Hilda does speed and res -6, and then she gives herself dominance if she's in 4 spaces of an enemy. And it's only the nearest enemy, unfortunately. Mrs. 2-Page over here. We got the Bunny Delthea. She does a speed and res debuff on the nearest foe in 5 spaces, I think it is. She does speed and res -6, and that's it. So it would have been nice if it chained to enemies, but it's fine. And then we got these two here, Aversa and Cornelia. They require enemies to be adjacent for their debuffs to activate. And that could go awry, right? It's not too hard to position your units in a way that they're not adjacent. So there is counterplay to these two, but if you're able to like get it to work, you can essentially hit the entire enemy team with debuffs with these two. So I feel like A is fair for them. We've got the OG Loki over here. She can inflict gravity or stall. It's stall if the enemies have a melee weapon, and it's gravity if the enemies have a ranged type of weapon. And she only needs to have 1 more points of HP than those targets, which is fine. And you can also run like Kanto control on her as well. It's a little shaky though using her now. I mean, a lot of the times we were using her back in the day was for Aether Raid's offense, because being able to just hit people with gravity like that was pretty effective. But it's not quite good enough now. There's so many warping effects that just gravity by itself, I think, is not enough. So, like, even if you gravity the enemy, they're just still going to jump in with, like, the warping they get from Catria or Cordelia anyway. So, not quite as strong, but still, it's got its uses. If only it was 3 columns and 3 rows instead of just 1 column and 1 row. Like, that would have been a little better for her. She'd be effective in summoner duels as well if that was the case. We got Iago up next. Iago's similar to Cornelia and Aversa, but he's a little different in that same regard. If the enemies are adjacent on... Hold on, let's pull it up. So he has 2 different effects that trigger on even and odd number turns. So he, like, flip-flops between what the effect is. So let's see here. At the start of odd number turns, if enemies have 3 less health than him, he does attack and speed -4 and guard on those foes. And then at the start of even number turns, if the foes have 3 less HP than him and they're adjacent, then he does defense and res -4 and panic. So he flip-flops between adjacent and not adjacent. So it's a little harder to counterplay him. You got to be paying attention to what the turn is and like all of that. And maybe you don't want to position your units in weird ways on those specific turns. So he can work, but also that's like not quite as good either, because sometimes you want to go for the panic or sometimes you want the guard specifically, and you're not able to always get the debuff that you want. So he's probably about as good as Aversa and Cornelia. All right, then we got Sias and Arvis. They have the exact same thing. Enemies in 3 columns centered on them take speed and attack, or I think it's attack and res -5, and then that's it. So another like easy debuff to activate. You can hit multiple enemies, similar to Brave Camilla. So that's okay, but using them as actual units is a little questionable these days. All right, next up we've got Kempf, also an A tier. This is another example of like ordering not mattering here in these tier lists, because clearly you'd rather use Kempf over these 2 in front of him. But I just like randomly put the units in tiers. So Kempf is able to do a flash effect on his target that he attacks and foes in 2 spaces of that target. He also does Discord after his refine, and then he also does 10 chip damage. So a pretty strong unit to be given like Flared Sparrow to. He can melt the enemies, he can flash them, and then also do Discord now, which is pretty good. He's really, really annoying in Pawns of Loki, so that's where you would get the most out of his debuff. And then finally we got Fomortis. So I'm not really too sure why I even put him on here, but like another questionable choice to be putting on here, similar to like Duo Nina and Duo Elise. I could have easily just left them off, but his debuff is interesting. It's like Satyr, where he can end enemy actions after combat, but it's really hard to activate this because he has to survive the round of combat, and that's not always going to be possible anymore, considering how crazy the offense creep has been. Like, you're just one-shotting everything at this point. Even if he's got, like, Hardy Bearing, and then he's got, like, Deflect Melee or Deflect Missile, it's very tough for this guy to live a round of combat. So I found that he just dies, and you're not able to really activate his effect. But if he's able to do it, and he's able to end enemy actions, it's very, very powerful. So I feel like he is at least worthy of having an A tier. And next up, we have the B tier, which is going to be the cutoff once again. You can still use these units. They're still usable for sure, but it's a little bit sus. So Elamine has False Start, which she just got, like, killed completely by King Freyr. He's on the same Aether Raid season as her, and he just completely shuts down anything that she can do. So Elamine's in a tough spot, but it's not like they're always going to have Freyr. You can still run her on like a backup team. You've got 5 offensive teams you can run for ARO. So in the event that they don't have Freyr, you can still bust out your Elamine. We have also Fiorm, who's in the same spot as Elamine. She's not really worthwhile running over Milla for Light Season. And then for Astra Season, she has to contend with Freyr. So just like Elamine, you put her on like one of your 5 teams if you're looking for isolation, but you're not always going to be able to use her if Freyr exists, so you got to watch out. Mordecai is pretty interesting. I actually really like what he does. So after he uses a movement assist, like Smite or Reposition, then the nearest foes within 4 spaces, or it might even be all foes. Hold on. I have this guy at +10, but I haven't used him in a while. Let's see here. Alright, so Mordecai. Alright, so after a movement assist is used, then he inflicts all stats -5 on foes within 2 spaces of unit and target through the next actions after movement. So 2 spaces is very steep. This is the reason why I don't have him higher. It's only 2 spaces. If this was like 4 spaces, this guy would have been such an ass kicker. He would have been amazing, actually. But 2 spaces, that's a little too strict for this. And then he also can do another effect here where he's doing special cooldown count +1 after the movement assist is used. So he can turn off pre-charged specials with that, which is nice. The ideal would be to use Smite. You want him to use Smite to get the furthest spaces, so then you can have the best chance of debuffing the enemies. So that's what you would want to do with him. But even though his effect is really good, it's really restricted on how far the space is, so that's why he's in B. Then we've got Elise and Veronica. They're free to run like all of the staff specials we talked about earlier. They don't have duo skills though, like this duo Elise, and then their actual debuff effects built into their weapons aren't the craziest. Like Elise has got Omni Rain, which is, it's fine, it's not the worst. And then Veronica does all stats -4 to the target and foes in 2 spaces. And then she has a further debuff effect where enemies in 2 spaces of her are taking defense and res -3. So she can be like kind of a support type of unit. Man, remember the olden days when this was like the best unit in the game almost? It was like her and not Flame Lyn, her and Brave Lyn were like the 2 best offensive units because we had no answer at all to Fire Sweep. This was before Null Sea Disrupt existed. So like her and Lyn just like dominated the game for so long. But they gave her almost nothing on her refine, unfortunately. All right, next up, we got Claude over here. His refine was crazy. You want to talk about wall of text refines? This guy, he won the lottery with that. So his only debuff is enemies in 3 columns and 3 rows centered on him take defense -7, which is perfectly fine. We don't mind that. It's only 1 stat, though, so that's why he's in B tier. Surtur. Oh, man, they are so afraid of this guy. They don't want to refine him for shit. And I kind of can understand why, almost. Like, His weapon, Sinmara, is still really nutty, if you think about it. It just does 20 free damage at the start of turn to all foes in 2 spaces. And then his unique C skill is doing all stats -4 to foes in 2 spaces. It's not very far. Only 2 spaces, that's not far enough. But if they refine them, if they gave him like a menace effect, can you imagine this guy with 4 space reach on that? Like Sinmara reaching 4 spaces, he would be busted. Like, he would actually be, like, probably, like, S or S plus tier. So, I can see why they don't want to refine him, but at the same time, he just give the boy a refine, right? It's been long enough. Mans came out in Book 2, and they can't even refine him. We're on Book 7 already. Okay, next up we have Solon over here. So, I don't even remember, like, exactly what he does, but I know he... On the start of turn 2 and 3, he does a lot of debuffs to the enemies that are in 5 rows and 5 columns. Let's see here. Okay, no, it's not 5 rows and 5 columns. It's 5 spaces. At the start of turn 3 and 4, he does all stats -6. He does gravity and guard and also flash on the closest foes in 5 spaces. So it's only the closest foes. If it was like all foes in 5 spaces, that would have been retarded. Like, that's... Forgive me for using that word. I'm from the olden days when we talked like that. He uses, like... This is crazy. Like, all stats -6, and then gravity and guard, and then flash. But it's only on turn 3 and 4, and it's only to the nearest foe. So we gotta have him in B tier. But, like, that's some nutty amount of debuffs that he's got. And then finally, C and D tier. This is where you probably don't want to be using this stuff until further notice. Like, Ashnard, he's probably gonna get a sick refine. He's kind of still usable a little bit. You can give him Guard Bearing 4 or Gambit 4, and he can kind of work. We're starting to get rain skills as Sacred Seals now as well, so that would combo with his rain effect on his weapon. So he's okay, but until he gets his refine, we don't really know how much potential he's going to have. Yilger and the Bride Darja are able to do a hold type of debuff, where they do certain stats debuffing to the enemies within 3 spaces of them, so that could be pretty useful. Mikoto's got built-in Kanto control, and that's about it. Although you can still give her like all the staff specials that we've gotten now, so that could help her out. And then Bunny Sharena and Bunny Katria, they both have double chills built into the weapon. So a little better than 1 chill, but not quite as good as having like Omni chill like Dorothea. And then finally D tier, like D tier is just, I don't even know, man. Darja's got a rain type of debuff. She does attack and speed -4 to foes in 2 spaces. That's probably the best that we're going to get out of D tier, though. Lilina's got built-in chill res, which is not enough. It's okay, but it's not enough. Fallen Takumi's got Scotty. So he does, at the start of turn 2 and 3, he does 10 chip damage to the enemies and inflicts panic if they're on 3 columns centered on him. It's only 3 columns, so you can't go like diagonally, you can't, or crossways, you can't get people in rows, which would have helped him a little bit, particularly in summoner duels. But I mean, like, to wait on turn 2 and 3 just to do that, that's not good enough. Then we've got Lute, who does a cardinal direction debuff. It's if she has 3 more res than the enemies, she does like speed and res -5 or something. It's not very good. It's not even worth talking about. And then Katarina also does a debuff as well. I can't remember what hers exactly was. Let's see here. So, Katarina, what is your debuff? Alright, the start of turn inflicts speed and res -4 on foes in cardinal directions with less res. Okay, so similar, kind of similar to Lute, I guess, but only cardinal directions. That's not quite good enough. Zafil is not good enough at all. He should be like all the way at the back, but ordering doesn't really matter. He just does like threaten defense at the start of the turn. Enemies in 2 spaces take defense -6. Like that is nowhere near good enough. Virion is okay. Like, he does panic to enemies that are adjacent to another enemy if they have 1 less health than him. But the problem with Virion is that he doesn't do anything else. It's only panic, and there's no guarantee the enemies are even running like blue bonuses to begin with. So if he was doing a little bit more, we could have had him a little higher here, but as it is right now, Averse is just like way, way better. And then finally we got Garnef, who... Garnef actually could have been kind of solid, but they restricted the hell out of his effect here. So what it does, it only targets non-magical foes, which is weird. If it targeted everybody, that would have been fine. So at the start of turn 3, he does 7 chip damage to non-magic foes in 5 columns centered on him. And then he also inflicts flash as well. Like, you can already see how that would have been pretty tight if it was to all enemies instead of just the enemies that are non-magic. So I had to have him in D tier. And that pretty much covers us for this debuff unit tier list. Hope you guys enjoyed the coverage, and no hard feelings for Hater yesterday. I gave her a little bit better grade today, which I think is deserved. I wouldn't have, like, changed my thoughts on her regardless of how y'all felt yesterday, but I mean, I feel like she probably is better as a debuffer than as a buffer, which might sound strange to some people because her buffing effects are like the main selling point to her. But there you guys go. That's going to wrap us up for this tier list. Let me know in the comments section what your thoughts are, and also if you have any recommendations for other videos you want to see. And this is your boy Tacho signing out. So take care, fellas, and I'll catch y'all again on the flip side.